Hey, I'm Tamara Kandaker, and you're listening to The Decibel from the Globe and Mail. More than 1,000 days after Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were arrested in China, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau told reporters on Friday that their ordeal was finally coming to an end.
About 12 minutes ago, the aircraft carrying Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor left Chinese airspace, and they're on their way home.
The release of Kovrig and Spavor, who've come to be known widely as the two Michaels, came earlier than expected, just hours after the United States reached a deferred prosecution agreement with Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, allowing her to go home to China. The Canadian government had said from the beginning that the two Michaels' arrests and eventual charges of espionage were arbitrary, a form of retaliation from Beijing. This all started when Meng was arrested by the RCMP in 2018 at the request of the US. Since then, she'd been waiting on a Canadian court to rule on her extradition to the States, where she was charged with fraud. She was accused of misrepresenting Huawei's relationship with its subsidiary Skycom in a meeting with the bank HSBC. Skycom had been doing business in Iran, and since the US had sanctions against Iran, this would have put HSBC at risk of violating those sanctions. Meng's homecoming is being celebrated as a huge victory in China. Here's Yves Tiberghien, a political science professor at the University of British Columbia and a political economist focused on Asia.
There were thousands of people lined up in the airport in Shenzhen, screaming and dancing and having music and all this, right? 100 million people watched her arrive live. And then he was all day long on Chinese TV and all over social media. This is like the biggest historical event for China in a long time.
Yves is on the show today, and we're going to unpack all of this. You're listening to The Decibel. Hello, Yves. Thank you so much for being here. Really great to talk to you.
Yeah, hello, Tamara. Thank you for having me.
So you knew before most people that this was going to happen, because when I messaged you on Friday, you said that you had a dream about the two Michaels being released even before you heard the news about the deal with Meng Wanzhou.
Yeah, that was very odd. I sometimes have had thoughts in the night about them, but this time I woke up suddenly at 2 a.m. Thursday night, and it was a very intense dream where the two Michaels were going to be freed. And I was in a conversation, I remember banging the table saying, this is long enough, we've got to end this.
Wow. Yeah, well, this is why you are a great guest for this. And I'm so glad to be talking to you today. So what are the details of the deal that Meng Wanzhou came to on Friday with the U.S. Department of Justice?
So first of all, we know it's been a long negotiation. The Wall Street Journal mentioned that the negotiations were ongoing as early as November 2020. It's been a long process. We know initially that the U.S. prosecutors and DOJ were going for the normal deal that they have had with other corporations in the past, especially European ones related to Iran sanctions. So usually they go for a guilty plea and then a fine. And then they let people go. And we also know that Huawei was refusing to do a guilty plea and probably refusing to do a fine. So the final deal is interesting. It's a typical diplomatic fudge. So it's a non-guilty plea. So Meng held firm on that. But she also signed a 4-page memorandum, a statement of facts, which acknowledges all the facts that the U.S. wanted to be recognized, including the fact that she basically lied about the true relationship between Huawei and Skycom. So the U.S. has a signed record, which basically admits guilt by U.S. law, but it's under a non-guilty plea.
So she was allowed to fly home, and then on the same night, Friday night, we heard that the two Michaels, who the Canadian government have always said were arrested in retaliation to Meng Wanzhou's arrest, were let go. What do you make of the way that this unfolded on Friday?
Yeah, it's remarkable. Of course, in the short term, we feel the joy to see the two Michaels going over. So first of all, the usual pattern when there has been, detentions like this, the case we remember in Canada is Kevin Gareth and his wife in 2014, 2016. The release also followed a deal on a Chinese citizen, Su Bing, but there was a delay between the two to disconnect the cases and in a way offer face to China. In this case, there was no such delay. I think this is the result of diplomacy. I believe strongly that given the amount of exchanges that there was between the US and China over this, and of course between Canada and the US, that the US side said, there's no way we're doing the deal unless you also free the two Michaels at the same time. They would not go for the delay. And Meng is such a high profile person for China, and this had so much echo for the public, right? That in this case, I think they accepted the immediate release.
Right. And we're kind of speculating, right? Because this was not part of the official deal between Meng and the US DOJ. And then, of course, the other thing that I wanted to mention was that there was a Chinese state-run newspaper that reported on Sunday that the two Michaels confessed their guilt for the crimes that they committed in China, and they were released on bail for medical reasons.
Right, and you heard the foreign minister, Mark Garneau, talked about this, and he said this was for domestic consumption. So this is a way to kind of explain it to their public, but clearly what we believe is that it is not that. What it is this high-stake diplomatic resolutions. So this is probably a very high-profile three-country complex negotiation that led to that.
Right. So the Canadian government's been trying to negotiate the two Michaels' release for a long time now, but China only released them after the U.S. reached a deal with Meng and she was allowed to go home. And a lot of experts had been saying that this is what it would take and that the U.S. would have to back down. But the U.S. did offer her a deal last year and she didn't accept it. So what was the difference between that deal and this deal?
Well, the main difference, as far as we can see, is she was not required to do a guilty plea. So in this case, it's under the headline of a non-guilty plea. And as far as we know, so far, there is no fine involved. The rest is similar, right? The statement of facts probably hasn't changed too much. And it's pretty clear, right? It follows, the case as presented by the U.S. Mm-hmm. So that's the main difference.
Mm-hmm. And so how do you think the U.S. got to the point where they were willing to accept this deal without the guilty plea?
Well, first of all, what we heard from the DOJ is they think that the statement of facts gets most of what they need. So that's the first thing. Second, there was intense diplomacy. And I think, first, President Biden was willing to do something to make sure the two Michaels would be released. And that was the only way out. There was intense conversation with Prime Minister Trudeau. And then third of all, we have to see that in a sense, the arrest of Meng has served its purpose for the U.S. In the meantime, they have launched a series of other attacks against Huawei. Huawei is seen as a security threat by the US and by Canada in the context of digital competition and in the context of close ties between Huawei and the PLA. And they have had since then much more effective tools, right? They have an embargo on chips for cell phones made by Huawei. They have successfully lobbied all allies to not let Huawei get into their 5G system. So in a way, the US has won that battle to a large extent against Huawei. And so the additional pursuit of Meng on this Iran sanction case may be less necessary, for American national security. And so the value maybe has gone down over time. Meanwhile, clearly there was this very high cost for Canada. We should add another sensitive thing in the whole case was the fact that President Trump early on spoke about it and said, it's great that we have Meng and now we have leverage in trade negotiations. That particular intervention by the president, of course, was taken to mean by the Chinese side that the whole case was political. Right. And it was actually seen as unhelpful by the Canadian side because Canada was following clearly the extradition treaty and rule of law. And so that was not a good thing to have. Right?
So we talked a little bit about the way that this unfolded and the timing of the release and why the Chinese government may have released the Michaels as quickly as they did. But there are a lot of people speculating that they may have been trying to send a message. And I wonder what you think of that. And is there some sort of message that we should be taking from the Chinese government's actions?
Well, I'm not too convinced that there is a message about the fast release, right? To me, I attribute the fast release to leverage from the US and Canadian side, right? That there was no way this time that the US Canadian side would accept a long delay for the release of the Michaels.
Right. Yeah.
So that's what I see. But there is something else that's worth saying is that clearly Canada was very successful in building a large coalition, international coalition of countries. They even signed this delegation against arbitrary detention. The number of countries that signed is now 66, right? So a large coalition of countries that stood up to, basically hostage diplomacy in response to the frustration that China had with the arrest of Meng. And the cost, therefore, of the arrest of the two Michaels was building up all the time, right? And so, for China too, they're very happy to let this end, right? I mean, there has been a growing cost involved.
I've seen a lot of people saying that this was hostage diplomacy, and some observers have been saying that we should be worried that China will keep doing this because they'll think that it worked to bring Meng Wanzhou home. What do you make of that?
Well, there is a danger because there was clearly a case of hostage diplomacy. And in this case, it led to this resolution, with planes crossing each other in the Pacific. But something else we should take from this whole story is that, so China, on one hand, is becoming a much bigger power. That's an unavoidable power for all global issues, right? We cannot discuss climate change. We cannot stabilize the global economy, avoid financial crisis, etc., without involving China. However, China is a fraught power because not only it has a political system that has always a degree of insecurity and must fight for its legitimacy, but on top of it, it emerges from a 150-year period of history, which has been very, very traumatic, right? Because you have to see that between 1840, the first Opium War, and basically 1949, China was beaten up year after year by one country after the other, leading up to the Japanese War in the end, and 20 million people dead, right? And so there is a true trauma. And we tend to say, the Communist Party exaggerates all this. And to some extent, they do propaganda movies and all this. But the fact is that it's there, right? It's unavoidable. And in psychology, when you have a trauma like colonization, right? When we study colonization anywhere in the world, the legacy is much deeper. The memory is much deeper among those who suffered than the perpetrators. That's why we Canadians, average Canadian did not know about residential schools. But if you talk to First Nations, they do know about residential schools, right? They never forgot. This is how important Meng was for them, right? And in the past, when people were taken in the imperial time, they were killed. This time she came back. So they take it as meaning in 1900 or in 1840, when the imperial powers, the Western imperial powers, did something, they always killed us and beat us up. This time we got our person back. That's how they read it, right? So they come out of this long period of very difficult entry into the modern age with a sense of great vulnerability and insecurity, as well as now a sense of pride and arrogance about the renewed power. But when you deal with China, you always deal with both things, the insecurity and the arrogance. You can see this with the release of Meng. The flight that Meng took out of Vancouver did not follow the normal route. It went straight north over the North Pole, did not reach the Alaskan airspace. And then from the North Pole went down Russia. And that was because they wanted to be far from the US in case the US would come back after her. That's the sense of insecurity.
Yeah.
And then when she landed, there was this massive unleashing of, TV program nonstop for hours and celebration about the new power of China, able to push diplomatic resolution of something like this. And there's so much pride, and that's the more pride side and the arrogant side. You always deal with both sides, and it's complicated. We have to learn how to manage that situation.
So at the end of all of this, how would you describe the impact this whole thing has had on Canada's relationship with China?
Well, the impact is profound, right? Because on the Canadian side, this arrest of the two Michaels is traumatic. It's also traumatic for us, right? On the Canadian side, Canada followed to the letter the extradition treaty with the US and its own extradition act, and then the rule of law and due process, and treated Meng with decency, right? She was on bail and she was in a very nice home. And so to see two Canadians arrested and being put in Chinese jail under harsh conditions, this is a big shock for Canadians, right? It affects the trust, it affects the understanding of China. And so this will have a deep legacy. But beyond that, in a long historical perspective, this will not be the biggest event either. The biggest event is we're living through a power transition, what we call a great power transition in international relations. China has the potential by the end of the 2020s to become the number one economy in the world and to be an equal great power to the US. And you're dealing with a country with a completely different political system and a different history. You have great frictions, you have great misunderstanding, you have potential for conflict across the board. And we Canadians are deeply connected to the West and to the US. And so we are part of this wild ride, right, of that power transition. And we're going to have a lot of issues to deal with. We have to learn how to do it without falling into war.
Now that this whole thing is finally over, what do you think should be Canada's approach to China moving forward?
Well, all Western countries are grappling with this, right? Because we're grappling with this growing power at the heart of the economy, at the heart of the global environmental system, and yet with this current more aggressive stance and the human rights violations that we cannot accept. And so ultimately the solution is some kind of variated, approach, which now Canada calls the 4Cs, a combination of competition, challenging, coexistence, and cooperation on things like climate. The US has a similar 4C approach. The EU has a similar 4C approach. In a way, we're stuck with this, right? So we have to learn to push back and protect the homeland where we have to. If there is any spying activity or any political activity by the Communist Party in Canada, we can't let this happen. Then we can stand up for the values that we believe in, human rights, etc. Yet we also have to be mindful that we need to work with China over the management of the global system and the global order and climate change, which is a huge crisis upon us. So we have to have this maturity in managing all those dimensions in a very complex relationship. We know that there is a great clash of interests going on, between existing powers and emerging power. But behind all this, it's striking how much psychology there is as well, how much misunderstanding, and how each country is reading the actions of the other through the lens of its own history. So when Canada and other nations stand up to China, it's striking how the Chinese side looks at it through the lens of their own history. And they say, it's exactly like 1900, where 8 armies from all Western countries invaded Beijing and Tianjin and forced a huge penalty on China. And so I think in this current moment, which is a very complex moment in history, it's crucial to understand what activates the mind of the other side. The case of Meng, we don't understand in Canada how emotional it had become in China. Yeah. And it was emotional because it was interpreted through a larger history, the trauma of their own history. And at least understanding that side, we could call this cognitive empathy. It's not to be compassionate toward them, and it's more to understand how they will act and therefore how we can act, to have effect. Eventually, we want to be very effective in what we do, and we want to pursue our interests, and get results, right? And so in this current period of history, psychology is playing a huge role, and we often downplay that.
What kind of impact do you think this has had on Canada's reputation on the international stage?
Oh, well, the impact is positive, right? Because, for the rest of the world, Canada was seen more as a victim. Canada always stood to its procedure, did not have political intervention in the legal proceedings. spoke very clearly, based on principles, and followed the principles. And in the end, the initial move was an American move, and the solution is an American solution. Canada followed all its proceedings and, treated Meng with decency in the process. So I think the Canadian reputation comes out very positive.
Okay, Yves, thank you so much for this conversation. I always learn a lot from you. I really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure, Tamara.
And that's it for today. I'm Tamara Kandaker. Our producers are Madeline White, Cheryl Sutherland, and Kasia Mihailovich. David Crosby edits the show. Angela Pacenza is our executive editor. Thank you so much to Yves Tiberghien. You can find him on Twitter at YVES_global. If you want to reach us, you can email us at thedecibel@globeandmail.com. If you want to reach me, I'm on Twitter at anima_tk. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.